As we head towards the 1990s, multiplayer video games have been commonplace, either at home using a game console or at the arcade. You know, a place where you bring in a bunch of quarters to either fight against one another or to compete against people's high scores. But then you have the PC gaming scene that is just starting to pick up thanks to many of the games adding support for both modem play and local area networks. The first popular game I can think of would be Doom. Thanks to its addicting multiplayer gameplay. I've once brought a brief explanation on how multiplayer gaming was originally done in the past. During the MS-DOS era, it was a matter of hooking up a computer through a new modem cable, or using a telephone line to call somebody's phone number for the game to communicate with one another. However, the major hurdle is the limitation of having just 2-player games only, compared to lugging your whole computer to somebody's house just to throw a LAN party. That is pretty much capable of supporting more than that. At least with games like Doom, it can support up to 4 players on a local network. However, it was around the time when the World Wide Web was starting to gain traction. While we would start seeing the rise of the internet, Bob Huntley and Keith Kimbrell, 2 developers from Houston, Texas, would create what would become one of the pioneers of online multiplayer gaming. That service in question would be called Doom Wide Area Network Game Organization, which is short for DWANGO. It was also thanks to the backing of the people at id Software that the service started rolling out with the release of the shareware version of Heretic, a game that was also powered with the Doom engine but was also developed by Raven Software. DWANGO was also one of the earlier services to adopt a subscription-based model, where originally people had to pay $1.95 per hour. However, by early 1995, it was changed to a monthly subscription model of $9.99 per month, keeping in mind that this is not counting the phone bills. Speaking of which, the way DWANGO operates is more similar to dialing into a bulletin board system, and I mean with an actual phone number. This meant that using the service would have been pricey, since not only you're having to cover the subscription cost to keep using it, but you also had to cover the long-distance phone charges as well. But on the bright side, the biggest strength DWANGO had was its ability to play 4-player deathmatches through a modem. DWANGO would also expand support for various games like Duke Nukem 3D, Terminal Velocity, and even Rise of the Triad somehow. Now, another contributor to DWANGO's legacy was the compilation of add-ons for games like Doom 2, which became one of the most popular map sets for Doom deathmatches to this day, particularly DWANGO 5, compiled on July 19th, 1995, which by that point is now a 30-year-old deathmatch WAD. Another set piece of DWANGO's success would be its contribution to the early days of esports. It was in October 1995 when a multiplayer tournament called Deathmatch 95 was being held as part of Microsoft's own Judgment Day event, which happened to be sponsored by various companies including id Software, Raven Software, and GT Interactive, which was the publisher for both companies. The format involved participants who became server finalists through online DWANGO matches. These finalists would also receive not only a trip to the tournament, but a 3-month VIP membership, a copy of Hexen, and a tournament t-shirt along the way. This was also the event that saw Dennis Fong, famously known as Thresh, defeating Stoney in the Grand Finals. While the matches before it involved Doom 2, the Grand Finals served as the launch party of Raven Software's Hexen Beyond Heretic. The 2 participants were given access to a pre-release copy of the game for warm-up, leading to the Grand Finals. Now, as a result of Thresh winning the tournament, he earned himself a 1-year VIP membership on a DWANGO server of choice, a lifetime supply of id Software titles, and a state-of-the-art Pentium multimedia gaming PC. Now, while Thresh would be known even more thanks to his tournament victory at the Red Annihilation event in May 1997, which saw him winning John Carmack's Ferrari, his victory at the 1995 event would serve as his first step forward into esports fame. One more detail to note would be that the event itself was bound to problems, with the players' preferred equipment not playing very nicely with the computers using Windows 95, along with some of the installed software becoming temperamental. Now, as many things become very popular, other developers start to cash in by developing their own subscription-based services, and we're going to talk about many of those. Catapult Entertainment had XBAND, which is mostly known for being one of the early pioneers of online multiplayer gaming on consoles. Originally for the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, they soon expanded to the PC market by launching a beta test in early 1996, with support for games like Doom, Hexen, and MechWarrior 2. However, it was around that time when XBAND had difficulty turning any profits, while the amount of users on there began to stagnate. Eventually, Catapult Entertainment was soon merged with Empath Interactive, which led to the introduction of MPlayer, another subscription-based multiplayer gaming service which by that time had slowly started to wane out due to more multiplayer games adopting the TCP/IP protocol. But more on that later. Now, what made MPlayer stand out during that time came about in early 1997, when it became freemium. This meant that players could play multiplayer games for free, while some games, along with some other extras, became locked down to MPlayer Plus, which cost $3.95 a month. Just like how DWANGO is more popular for games like Doom, MPlayer was more popular for games like Quake, which was a game that Empath attempted to optimize as it wasn't friendly towards dial-up connections. Ultimately, this soon died out following the release of QuakeWorld towards the end of 1996, but it didn't stop Empath from supporting QuakeWorld as well. Other noteworthy games that MPlayer would support were Warcraft, Blood, Command & Conquer, Rainbow Six, and even Unreal. A few of these games I've mentioned were also locked down to the Plus model. What also contributed to MPlayer's success was the ability to play casual games online like Checkers and Reversi. MPlayer would also become one of the first services to utilize audio-based chatting, and that would be thanks to Empath's Hear Me technology. As most of these services had support for shareware titles, the next known multiplayer gaming service also made it more known through enabler programs, and that service in question would be the Total Entertainment Network. It is a service that you might remember seeing advertised in games such as Duke Nukem 3D and Shadow Warrior thanks to the partnership with 3D Realms. I should probably note that with services continuing to form like MPlayer and 10, it was becoming pretty much clear that there was some competition on which one was the most optimized for dial-up users, a time when finding consistent low-latency connections proved to be a major challenge. 10 would partner up with Concentric Network Corporation to offer internet access dial-up numbers to consumers which would provide optimized and reliable low latencies for multiplayer. On top of the goal of optimizing latencies, a common practice with the subscription business model that many of the services adapted was striking deals with game developers to support their services, which allowed access to the game's source code for optimization, which is seen for games like Warcraft Orcs and Humans. Specialized builds of games were made, while some games implemented command line parameters to support some of these services, like Warcraft 2 for example. But as we were reaching closer to the late 1990s, the subscription-based model was starting to completely die out for a variety of reasons. Let's start with the first culprit. It was in 1994 that 3 developers, Scott Coleman, Alex Markovich, and Jay Cotton, created the original version of Kali for MS-DOS. Kali was a successor to iDoom, which later became iFrag, a software that Colton wrote so he could play Doom multiplayer over on the internet, but support for more games started to grow following the release of Descent in 1995. However, what makes Kali stand out from the rest is the ability to play practically any game on the internet as long as it uses the IPX protocol, which is why Kali is pretty much referred to as an IPX emulator. Now, what it does is it translates the packets from IPX to TCP/IP, and it's a similar approach that Classic Gaming Arena is doing, and that is something I need to discuss in another video. Originally, Kali was geared towards tinkerers like myself, due to the struggle of getting TCP/IP to work under MS-DOS. Windows users will never know the struggle if you get what I mean. Now, what made Kali even more popular was the release of Kali 95, which you guess it is a version of Kali for Windows 95. Which I guess makes sense because if you see a name at the time and it has 95 slapped on it, it's pretty obvious that it's a port for Windows 95 or even a program made for it entirely. Now the real icing on the cake, the best one I might add, is that Kali was shareware, with users being able to play for free for a limited time, and purchasing a serial number for $20 grants you access to Kali for as long as the key was valid. Kali served as one of the only ways to play games that weren't supported by others with varying success. I mean, why bother paying a monthly subscription to play games like Necrodome when one can play it on a service that's considered a one-time purchase? You can even play it as long as you like with no extra costs, while even playing more obscure titles that weren't supported like Firefight by Chaosworks and Epic Mega Games. The more popular games that were played on Kali that I can recall were Descent, Warcraft 2, Duke Nukem 3D, and Command & Conquer. Of course, Kali would also have its own competition against Khan, a software by Stargate Networks, offering a cheaper alternative for $15. However, people saw no reason to switch since Kali was already well established. Now, there were two noteworthy game services like Heat.net by Segasoft and Microsoft's own Internet Gaming Zone. You're in the zone, baby! Despite having a supported games list like the earlier subscription-based services did, it carried over the IPX emulation formula that Kali had as well. Now, while the two services were pretty much free to use, what was the major difference between all the services we have talked about is that they are both browser-based. That's right, even before people can go as far as to play online multiplayer games on a browser such as Google Chrome, people had to use Internet Explorer to use these services. Despite the fact that you can now have a space to play IPX multiplayer games, there comes the eventual downfall, which is the second culprit. It was dating back to Kali's popularity that Blizzard Entertainment, who developed Warcraft 2, had a good relationship with Kali, which explains why the game was shipped with War2Kali.exe for optimized to play. However, it was around the time when Blizzard was developing their upcoming titles such as Diablo and StarCraft that the idea of integrating a way to play their games online for free within the game itself came to light. Blizzard would soon launch Battle.net, and it gained popularity thanks to the fact that you are not relying on some external piece of software to play online, since it's all in one. While Diablo and StarCraft would be the first two games to support Battle.net, Warcraft 2 would also get ported over to Windows with Battle.net support in 1999, which further dwindled Kali's popularity. Not to mention that Blizzard's own rival, Westwood Studios, did something similar with the debut of Westwood Online, with support starting with the Macintosh port of Command & Conquer in 1996. Then there is the third culprit, which was the push for TCP/IP multiplayer gaming. Towards the end of 1996, id Software released QuakeWorld, which was optimized for online multiplayer thanks to client-side movement prediction. However, during its early days, finding servers was a bit of a hassle until the release of QuakeSpy, which eventually evolved to GameSpy 3D. TCP/IP in regards to multiplayer gaming eventually became a standard, since you don't have to heavily rely on a service thanks to the fact that you can run a dedicated server. It was about as simple as firing up the game or a launcher of choice and connecting to a desired IP address that the server is running on. Even most of the multiplayer games during the IPX era pretty much lacked the ability to join in-game. However, there were only some exceptions that I can think of, like Quake, Descent, and Terminator Skynet. And then there is finally the fourth culprit, which would be the tech evolving as time progressed. Starting with Windows 95, many MS-DOS games were actually playable, thanks to the fact that the operating system was built on top of the aging MS-DOS. However, it was not reliable, so Microsoft began a slow push towards their Windows NT kernel. It would eventually begin to show following the releases of Windows 2000 and XP respectively, but compatibility for MS-DOS programs would be butchered and soon completely phased out following the releases of Windows Vista and onward. It also didn't help by the fact that towards the late 1990s, we would see less MS-DOS titles coming out thanks to the combination of developers making their games exclusively for Windows, along with pushing out support for 3D accelerators, which was heavily popular by that point. Granted, there were MS-DOS games that made use of the Glide API for 3dFX Voodoo cards. It was likely easier to have support for that in one package, and Quake 2 was an example of that. But regardless of that, Microsoft had Direct Play, which enabled support for the 4 standard methods, which meant at times that you could pretty much play early Windows titles through Kali in the Internet Gaming Zone. Now, these 4 culprits are what led to the downfall of many multiplayer services. Some even pretty much having their own demise before Windows NT was finally pushed out to the average consumer. DWANGO's popularity started to dwindle by the end of 1995, and Quake probably made it worse. Therefore, DWANGO shut down in 1998. However, its legacy still lives on within the Doom community thanks to its compilation of Deathmatch WADs, while also playing a part in the rise of esports. Despite XBAND being merged with MPlayer in 1996, it soon suffered from lack of profit, and it would be acquired by GameSpy towards the end of 2000, with the only remains being that of GameSpy Arcade, which of course lasted until 2014 when GameSpy soon shut its doors as well. I should probably mention that there was an attempt to revive MPlayer, however it does look to be dead on arrival the last time I checked on it years ago. Maybe I could make a short video about it? Maybe. Total Entertainment Network would soon shut down shop in 1998 to shift focus on browser games by becoming Pogo.com. Heat.net would also suffer from financial issues, and to make matters worse, the service introduced a degree system which allowed players to get paid to play per hour. This would lead to a lot of abuse during its final days, as people would leave the program running and make $4 per day. It even got worse when the Quake 2 servers had about 30 idling players just to make a profit. Segasoft would make attempts to stop this behavior by creating the parking police, which would go around looking for such rooms, but it didn't stop some people from faking a LAN game while still logged on to Heat.net. By that point, the damage had already been done and Heat.net was pretty much gone by the end of October 2000. Which leads to the final 3, Kali, Khan, and the Internet Gaming Zone. Khan had a somewhat niche following after it became freeware on a site called Khan Central, but it was soon forgotten by around 2005. The Internet Gaming Zone stuck around primarily as a way to play games like Age of Empires online, while MSN cashed in on the indie game market alongside Oberon Media by offering 60-minute game trials. Ultimately, the Gaming Zone would soon shut down in 2006 to completely focus on the indie game market, thus leading to Kali being the only service left online to this day, surprisingly. However, Kali has since faded away into obscurity, and it's no longer recommended to use by today's standards, since it requires port forwarding along with some trial and error. Nowadays, there are better methods to playing classic multiplayer games, thankfully. For MS-DOS titles, I recommend checking out Classic Gaming Arena, as it not only enables users to play games like Doom 2 and Blood a bit more conveniently through DOSBox, but it also allows some enthusiasts like myself to play these games on period-accurate hardware running Windows 95 or 98. On the Windows side, however, it's a little bit tricky, but it's still doable. Since Direct Play was not made for modern connections, utilizing hardware-based firewalls, and with each modern version of Windows coming out, continues to break direct play even more. Thankfully, programs such as Game Ranger and IPX Wrapper exist. With IPX Wrapper, however, you can use a DOSBox IPX dedicated server to play online more easily without needing to port forward nor mess around with VPNs like Hamachi. Despite these services no longer being around nowadays, their legacies will still live on, even if it's just a set of maps that even the Doom community still plays to this day. Anyway, that's about it for this video. If you happen to have any memories using any of these multiplayer services, I would like to hear your stories. This video's Patreon vocal shoutouts goes to Kuji. Thank you for your support, and also, thank you all for watching, give 5 money for Booba, and peace out.